Okay, in this assignment, we're going to review some of the properties that we're going to be using throughout the year. This is not all of them, but this is the basic ones that you've probably seen before. You probably remember some of these terms. We're just going to go over them again, and then you can complete your assignment. Again, please print off this guided note from Schoology and follow along while you're listening. The commutative property. You probably remember this one. You've seen this one for a long time. Basically, the commutative property says the order of values do not matter if you're adding or multiplying. This does not work for subtraction or division. Some examples. Well, the algebraic term or definition says if I take A plus B, that's the same as B plus A. For example, 2 plus 5, well, that's 7, of course. Well, that's the same as 5 plus 2, which is 7. So basically it means you can add numbers in any order and you'll come up with the same thing because the order doesn't matter. Multiplying is the same way. X times y is the same as y times x. Okay. Remember, we don't use the multiplication symbols in algebra. You can use the dot if you want in between, or if it's two variables, you can just put them together. That means the same thing. That implies multiplication. Okay. If I said 6 times 3, which is 18, if I change that order and did 3 times 6, well, that's also 18. So there you go, commutative property. You can add or multiply in any order and you can get the same thing. Okay? Does not work for subtraction or division. Associative property basically says that the grouping of values does not matter, again, if we're adding or multiplying. This one's the same as a commutative property. It does not work for subtraction or division. Grouping, or I like to say numbers that are associated together. Numbers that are associated together, we show that with grouping symbols or parentheses. So the algebra definition says if I took A plus B and then added C to that, that is the same as if I first added B and C and then added A to it. So these are the numbers that are associated together here, and these are what's associated together here. To look at a number example, if I said 5 plus 1 plus 3. Well, 5 plus 1 is 6, and 6 plus 3 is 9. If I didn't change the order, but I changed the grouping, 5 plus 1 plus 3. 1 plus 3 is 4, and 4 plus 5 is 9, and I got the same on either side. I changed the grouping, or the numbers that were associated together, and I got the same thing. It works for multiplication. If I said 2 times 4 times 7, or if I said 2 times 4 times 7, would I get the same thing? 2 times 4 is 8. 8 times 7 is 56. 4 times 7 is 28. 28 times 2 is 56. So I got the same thing. So again, it works for addition or multiplication, but not subtraction and not division. All right, the identity property. The identity property says that the way I like to think of it is if I do something to a number and that number does not change, then I've probably used an identity property. Okay? And again, this one works for addition and multiplication as well. The identity property basically means the number stays the same. Or I like to say it keeps its identity. That's the identity property. It keeps its identity. If I said, what is 9 plus 0, you get 9. I've taken a number and I've added something to it, and I got the same number again. Of course, Adding 0 to any number gives you that same number. Okay? The 9 kept its identity. If I took a number and multiplied it by 1, 14 times 1, well, that's 14. Multiplying a number by 1 does not change that number. So the identity property for addition basically says you're adding 0. You're adding nothing to that number, and that number will stay the same. For multiplication, you're multiplying by 1. If you multiply a number times 1, that number doesn't change. It stays the same, or it keeps its identity. So that's the only way the identity properties is used. Adding 0 to a number is an identity property, or multiplying by 1 is an identity property. All right, halfway there. The inverse property. The inverse property, inverse kind of means the opposite. So the inverse property, using opposites to cancel a value. So if I was going to take the number 6, if I added its opposite, the opposite of 6, of course, is negative 6. And if I add opposites, what do you get? Well, you get 0. So adding the opposite gives you 0. That's how the addition inverse property works. For multiplication, it's a little bit trickier, so you'll want to pay attention to this. If I took a number like 2/3 and I multiplied it times its reciprocal, remember what a reciprocal is? You take a fraction and you flip it upside down. So if I flip 2/3 upside down, I get 3/2. And if I multiply those, okay, remember multiplying fractions is the easiest operation to do. You just multiply straight across. Top shelf, 2 times 3 is 6. Bottom shelf, 3 times 2 is 6. And 6 divided by 6 is 1 whole. So this is how the inverse property of multiplication works. You're multiplying by a reciprocal. So you multiply by a reciprocal. This, for the addition one, you're adding opposites. Those are both inverse properties. Adding the opposite gives you 0, or multiplying by the reciprocal will give you eventually the whole number 1. All right, property of 0. This one's easy. Multiplying by 0 always equals 0. Multiplying anything times 0 gives you 0. If it's a fraction and you multiply it times 0, you get 0. If it's a decimal, if you multiply it by 0, you get 0. Multiplying anything by 0 gives you 0. That's a pretty easy one. And then the distributive property. We're going to touch on this today, and we're probably going to spend a little more time on this next week because this one is important. This is one that you will use for the rest of your high school math classes. So every math class you take from here on out, you're going to use this. You've been using it. We're going to refresh. So basically, the distributive property says that you're going to multiply a value to an expression inside the parentheses. So if you have something on the outside of a parentheses, multiplied times that whole parentheses, you're going to multiply what's out here times everything that's inside the parentheses, one at a time. So A times the B, we're just going to write that as AB. A times the C, we're just going to write that as AC. And I'm using a plus sign here because this is we're assuming this is a positive number, and that's a positive number, and a positive times a positive would give me a positive. So that's why I'm using the plus sign. Let's look at ones that we will be using probably. Let's put a number to it. Makes sense a little bit more. So here I have a number being multiplied times x plus 7. So this is what this expression says is 2 times x plus 7. The distributive property says I can multiply this 2 times each one of these one at a time. 2 times x is just 2x, and 2 times positive 7 is a positive 14. I say the sign positive or negative because that will determine what sign you're going to use right here. Let's look at a different one. If I said, and this one would be a little bit tricky, negative 5 times y minus 3. Well, negative 5, I'm going to multiply that times all of this inside the parentheses one at a time. Negative 5 times y is negative 5y. Negative 5 times, I want you to treat this as a negative 3. I know it's a subtraction sign. Subtraction signs, you treat them the same as this was a negative 3. So really what this is saying is negative 5 times negative 3. Well, a negative times a negative is a positive, and 5 times 3 is 15. So that would be the best answer for that. Okay, this video was rather quick. We went through the properties. Again, the community property, we're changing the order, doesn't change the result. The associated property, we're changing the grouping, doesn't change the result. The identity property says that I'm doing something to a number, and that number is not changing. Adding 0 is an identity property, or multiplying by 1 is an identity property. The inverse property, using opposites to cancel out a value. 6 plus negative 6 would be 0. They cancel each other out. 2/3 times 3 over 2 gives me 6 over 6, but eventually gives me 1 whole. They cancel each other out and gives me 1. Property of 0, multiplying by 0 always gives me 0 no matter what it is, even if it was a variable. If I said, what is y times 0? Well, it's 0 because it doesn't matter what this number is. The distributive property, you multiply what's on the outside of the parentheses times everything that's on the inside of the parentheses, one at a time. And we're going to spend some more time on the distributive property later, but these are your notes for assignment 2. Complete that by Friday at 3 p.m. If you have any questions, please call me or text me or email me.